As round one approaches with the MBA applications at the moment, I'm getting the question quite often from people like, what do you think my chances are? What's the market doing? Because interestingly, if we go back to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw an increase in the number of people applying, which is not uncommon. Traditionally, we've seen in the MBA market that when there's some kind of financial crisis or dip in the market, that people often flock to business school. But at the same time, we were also seeing people who had offers looking to defer because some people weren't keen on this idea of studying a hybrid program or even having to go online. And so at that time it did create opportunities for some people, and we did find some universities and business schools that traditionally demand a higher standard were not necessarily lowering that standard, but there were maybe a couple of people who were perhaps 20-30 points below the GMAT score we'd normally expect were finding that they could potentially get those opportunities, and I think that was great. But as we progressed through the pandemic, so last year, 2021, we actually saw universities and business schools up the standard again, and they were becoming much more demanding and pushing for test scores. Even though some were offering waivers, a lot of business schools were still saying, no, we want the score, prove us to us that you've got it. And so what are we seeing this year? I think we're seeing a couple of things. Candidates who read the news a lot will of course know that a lot of the big tech companies up in the US, especially Silicon Valley, a lot of startups are letting people go at the moment. There's this fear that we're going to tip into a recession. And so that means there's probably likely going to be some good, strong candidates in the market. I think that's definitely going to happen. But what I always tell people is the same thing. Business schools, and I'm going to include in this law schools and any university, okay, always want great candidates. So even though there may well be more candidates than normal applying, if you are a strong candidate in terms of your test score, your academic background and your profile, the most important thing you can do is ignore all of the other people out there and focus on your own individual case. There's no point worrying about what other candidates are doing. And so as we push later into 2022, we're going to be in round two just in a few months' time. And as we go into 2023, I envisage that there will be that sort of surplus of applicants, so to say. I think if we get closer to a recession, more and more people are naturally going to think this is the time to take on the debt. Now is the time to go to business school, and hopefully I can hit the job market on the up on the way out. So that is something to consider. So I would encourage people out there who are maybe thinking like, I want to get into a top tier school, or I want to get into something in that sort of top 25, to think carefully about test scores. It's not the only element of an application, but it's no doubt an important one. And so if you're sitting around 600 and thinking, okay, can I get into my target schools in the top 25? I would encourage you to really be thinking, how can I push to 650? How can I push to 670? Just to give me that competitive edge. So that would be sort of my view of the market at the moment, and there are going to be some challenges along the way, but I think there's always going to be opportunities, especially if you've got great work experience to share. GMAT and GRE are an important part of the MBA application process. There's no doubt about that, and for the US, I've always told people it really is an essential part. Some schools will offer waivers now, but that means at the same time, if you haven't got a GMAT or GRE score, you do have to show some other type of evidence, whether it's a high GPA or substantial amounts of work experience. And so when we do come across people with lower scores or no scores in GMAT or GRE, the typical discussion moves away from the US. more towards European and UK schools. And I'll explain why that is. The reputation of European and UK schools is very good. And many of them will seek to hire the highest caliber of candidates. But I've always been a firm believer that GMAT and GRE doesn't always define us. I've been fortunate enough to work with men and women who have been directors of large international organisations quite early on in their careers, and for one reason or another GMAT or GRE has been something they've struggled with. Maybe in some cases they haven't even had time to study for it because they're too busy leading 50 people, 100 people. And so if I'm having a conversation with someone who doesn't have those test scores, I tell them, look, for the US, it's going to be very hard without. There may be some options there. I mean, I've had somebody get into Kellogg, somebody get into UC Marshall, for example, without test scores. That was more during the pandemic, or the sort of start of the pandemic, when schools were offering some of that sort of flexibility. But if you don't have those scores, it's certainly not the end of the world. And if you look to the UK, sure, London Business School, Manchester, the typical schools that will ask for some kind of score. But a lot of universities in the UK don't necessarily ask for GMAT or GRE. And there's some great programs out there, like the University of Durham in the north of England, which is essentially the third university just behind Oxford and Cambridge in the rankings, has an MBA where you don't need GMAT. You've got Edinburgh that is largely flexible, and again a very good program. The University of Liverpool. These are all universities with great international reputations that will not necessarily ask for test scores. And then people ask me, well, if they're not asking for these scores, do they deliver the same things that a top MBA in the US will deliver? Well, the answer is yes and no. It's perfectly possible to have a very successful career coming from universities that are not asking for these types of test scores. Because I think there's more to life than just a standardised test. You may get a 700 in your GMAT, but there's no guarantee that you're going to be a great candidate or a great post-MBA job applicant. So I think the important thing to do is to always look around at the different options that are out there and consider, is the MBA the route you want to go? Perhaps is it going to be more towards a master's? There's lots of different options that people without test scores can explore.